In one of our makeup lectures for the MIS class, we were talking about mannerisms, this late 16th century development after the High Renaissance, where we see in a number of different artists after around 1520 a loss of the sort of stability and harmony and unity that we'd seen in so many different Renaissance works of art. Parmigianino's Madonna, for example, not as balanced as Raphael. His sense of unified space disrupted by the scale difference between the Virgin and that tiny figure that seems to be directly behind her. A sense of crowding and a sort of abnormal anatomy. All of these things parts of the Mannerist style. We also looked at Tintoretto, who upsets the perfect symmetry of Leonardo's Last Supper by putting the table at an angle that plunges into space, throwing the disciples' table off to the left, making the composition asymmetrical, darkening it in a way that adds to the confusion. You can make out Christ but few of the other figures. Even in mythological figures, we find that while Botticelli's Birth of Venus was a bit confusing in its subject matter, it was laid out very clearly. The four principal figures, very easy to see, separate from each other. The anatomy is relatively easy to understand. Bronzino's image of Venus, on the other hand, convoluted, crowded, extraordinarily artificial color choices, anatomies that simply don't work. All of these were hallmarks of the Mannerist style. In this art fix, what we're going to look at is Michelangelo during this period, because he lived deep into the Mannerist era. He doesn't die until the 1560s, whereas Leonardo and Raphael both passed away in the 1510s. And in fact, as we look at late works by Michelangelo, what we see is that after the 1530s or so, his works are also Mannerist in style and shares all of these characteristics of Mannerist art. So while Michelangelo is early in his career the primary proponent of High Renaissance art, later in his career he becomes drawn into this new Mannerist movement. In particular, with the Last Judgment here, we look at the body of Christ at the top. And you'll notice that it's not only massive, but it's contorted, unnatural. He's extremely broad across the beams. He's not articulated well. The legs don't seem to quite match up with the hips. This is very much Mannerist in conception. Also, his posture. Is he standing or seated? Gives it a sense of imbalance, which is also a hallmark of Mannerist art. Now, this spread of Michelangelo's figures, the broadening in the bodies of these figures, is something that we can actually see develop through the course of his works. For example, when we look at the David and the Adam from the Sistine ceiling, just below, or just above the Last Judgment, we can see that Michelangelo's conception of the perfect human anatomy has changed through the years, going from the rather slender David, at least by comparison, to a broader Adam, to a significantly broader Christ that we see on the right. This change seems to have begun when Michelangelo moved to Rome in 1506 after completing the David. And it probably had everything to do with an increased contact with ancient Roman art. In particular, this one work, the Laocoon and his Sons, which was unearthed in Rome shortly after Michelangelo arrived there. It had belonged to the Roman Emperor Titus back in the 1st century, and it was unearthed by archaeologists working for Pope Julius II. And when they began to dig it up, it was well known through literature. When they began to dig it up and realize what it was, Pope Julius called all of his court artists to the site. So Michelangelo was actually there as they drug this out of the earth. It was then put on public view in the Vatican, and it seems to have been instrumental in how Michelangelo moves from a slightly thinner David rigidity of which the Laocoon one is one of the best examples. So what we see when we look at Michelangelo's work is that his body just keeps getting broader and broader, even on the Sistine Chapel. Between the creation of Adam and the fall of man, it's almost as if Adam has bulked up even more and gotten thicker still. So if we look at 4 examples, tracing our way over 40 years, 35, 40 years, we see that Michelangelo's figures get broader and broader and broader still. This is the trajectory. So we're part of Michelangelo's mannerism, which is this unnatural anatomy that we see here, is in fact part of a development that had been taking place over the course of decades and really explodes in the Mannerist period. Now, this wider body that we see in the Christ in the center, Michelangelo uses it everywhere. Every one of the figures has this sort of massive form. Look, for example, at this fellow here, or the man just next to him. Even if they're women, they have that same incredible strength and solidity in the center of the body. Michelangelo has moved away from direct observation of the figure and has moved towards this sense of form that is based on dense and massive muscularity. We see it really everywhere you look. Equally Mannerist is the crowding of the composition. Many of the figures seem imbalanced, slipping and sliding around the throne as if Michelangelo, the painter, did not quite provide them enough space to exist. The fellow holding the cross, for example, seems to be having some trouble staying on that cloud. The figure behind him here also having significant trouble staying up, if you will. This crowding is something we've seen in other Mannerists' works as well. Also amplified is the sense of emotion. Michelangelo's figures seem absolutely terrified. They'd always been animated by some inner vibrancy, almost an inner anxiety. But at this point in his career, they're absolutely terrified. And this figure, of course, is right in the line of Christ's wrath that leads from his hand down to hell in the lower right corner. So he pretty much has every reason to be terrified. Now, a bit of background on the work itself, how it came into being. The Last Judgment was begun about 25 years after Michelangelo had completed the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Remember that this is the Pope's private chapel, and it was commissioned by a later Pope, Pope Paul III. And a lot had happened in church history in the time between these two works, between the completion of the ceiling and the completion or the beginning of the Last Judgment. In particular, the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther had nailed his list of 95 protest points to the wall of the church in Wittenberg, Germany. The local archbishop was challenged to a debate, refused to show up, and this formed the Catholic Church's official response to Luther, which was to ignore him and hope that it would just go away. By the 1530s and 1540s, however, it was clear that Protestant Christianity was not going anywhere, and the church needed to craft a response. They decided to reform from within, and Pope Paul III sponsored a series of church conventions that led to what's known as the Counter-Reformation, the church's attempt to respond to the need for reform, but to do it from within, to counter the Reformation that was begun by Martin Luther. The Sistine Chapel Last Judgment is intended as a metaphor for church reform. We see Christ turning his attention to the damned, focusing his judgment on those who have strayed. The Catholic Church remains, with this visual metaphor, the lone authority to judge. St. Peter, who you see here, holding his keys, is pleading with Christ to save the damned, but you'll notice that he doesn't look particularly happy either. And if again, this is part of the message. Only the Pope, St. Peter was the first Pope, only the Pope can intervene on behalf of the damned. But it seems almost as if he's not about to do it anytime soon. In fact, the only figure who seems concerned about the souls of mankind is the Virgin Mary here, on the left, who casts her eyes downward toward the souls that are coming toward heaven. This will help us then to read the composition. The way the Last Judgment works is that the figures on your left are the souls rising from their graves and being called toward heaven. They're on Christ's right, which makes them the chosen ones, the saved, whereas on Christ's left are the damned who are being cast down into hell. So here in the lower right corner, we see angels coming down to rescue people from their graves, to pull them up toward heaven. You'll notice in the center there's a figure that looks very, very much like Adam. He's in quite the same pose as Adam, and being brought forth into his salvation. This is one of the few ways in which Michelangelo ties the figures from the Last Judgment to the ceiling above. Directly above that, we see these souls being now welcomed into heaven, although you'll notice they all seem a little terrified about it all. Notice again with these two figures down below, Michelangelo's broad bodies, but these muscular figures above are helping to welcome them into a very, very crowded heaven. And just to the right of this, you see another figure pulling people up by a rosary. This is again a particularly Catholic aid for prayer, and it is being used to help rescue these souls. On the opposite side, the damned are being cast into hell. There's sort of a war between the angels and these souls, and you'll see our frightened figure there being dragged down toward heaven. On this side, there are some saints up above, and you'll notice directly at the feet of Christ is this figure, is St. Bartholomew. By legend, St. Bartholomew was skinned alive, and so he sits here holding his flayed skin, but his body miraculously revived into its perfected state. He holds a knife toward Christ, the mode of his own martyrdom. The knife that he's holding is actually a sculptor's tool, and a lot of people suggested that St. Bartholomew is seen as sort of a metaphor for a self-portrait for Michelangelo. And indeed, the flayed skin that he's holding in his hand has a broken nose, and Michelangelo had a broken nose as well. That is his earthly skin abandoned as he enters heaven. But again, almost as if he sees himself directly in the line of Christ's judgment. Now, one of the things you've probably noticed is the amount of nudity within Michelangelo's Last Judgment. This was something of an innovation on his part. We see Giotto's Last Judgment from the Urbina Chapel on the left. Normally, the souls of the saved, in images of the Last Judgment, were clothed because that was more decorous, that was more proper. Michelangelo's use of nudity for the saints as well as the sinners met with a significant amount of criticism from the papal court. In fact, the Pope's own master of ceremonies wrote a letter to the Pope about this, telling him it was very disgraceful, he said. All those nude figures exposing themselves so shamefully. He went on to say that the painting belonged instead in a public bath or a tavern, and not in the Pope's own chapel. Michelangelo heard of this criticism and decided to take a bit of pictorial revenge on this court member from the papal court. In the lower right corner, we see the mouth of hell opening, and we see Charon with his boat leading the damned souls across the river Styx to be thrown into hell. Hell is on the right, red behind, and we see a figure standing in front of it. This is Minos, the judge of the underworld. And what Michelangelo did was to put the features of that critic from the papal court onto the figure of Minos. Gave him donkey ears, which is a sign of foolishness, and went a step further, putting him in hell and leaving him here entirely wrapped up with a serpent who, in fact, is eating his groin. So this was Michelangelo's pictorial judgment. What's interesting, of course, is that the judge got the last word. After Michelangelo's death, the Counter-Reformation declared that all nudity in religious works was to be abandoned, and someone was hired to paint over the nude figures in Michelangelo's work. And many of these remained painted over all the way to the 1980s, when some of them were in fact cleaned off. But here we see St. Catherine, who was martyred on a spiked wheel, and she was originally nude, but she still retains these clothes that were painted onto her later. Once the Counter-Reformation, the movement that had inspired the Last Judgment theme in the first place, had decided that Michelangelo's conception was not part of what they wanted.